My phone showed 17 missed calls from my mother-in-law by 9:15 on a Monday morning, and I turned it face down on the conference table without answering a single one and kept talking to the woman across from me about centerpiece vendors for her daughter's June wedding, because that is what you do when you are in the middle of your first client meeting in the company you built from nothing in 6 months while nobody was watching, and the person calling is the woman who spent 7 years telling people you were just her assistant. My name is Claire Ashworth. I was 34 years old, sitting in a home office I had converted into a proper meeting space with a second-hand conference table and 2 chairs and a window that looked out on a garden I had been ignoring since October, and my mother-in-law Diane Pearce was calling from the offices of Pearce Events, the company I had spent 7 years running without ever once having my name on the door. And I was not picking up. The woman across from me, a lovely, soft-spoken pediatric surgeon named Angela who was planning her only daughter's wedding with the focused intensity of someone who had been waiting 30 years for this particular project, did not know any of this. She knew only that she had been referred to Ashworth Events by her colleague whose son's corporate gala I had managed 3 weeks earlier, and that the woman sitting across from her had a clear, organized answer to every question she had asked in the preceding 40 minutes, and that she felt for the first time since she had started making calls about this wedding that she was talking to someone who actually understood what she needed. I had felt that feeling from the other side of the table for 7 years. I knew exactly what it was worth. "I think we're going to be a good fit," Angela said at the end of the meeting, and I thanked her and walked her to the door and watched her car back out of my driveway. And then I stood in my converted home office and looked at my phone. 17 missed calls had become 22. I put the phone in my desk drawer and went to make coffee, because there was a full week of work to get through and none of it was going to get done by answering a call I had been preparing for since the Friday afternoon 3 weeks earlier when I had cleaned out my desk at Pearce Events for the last time, taken the single personal photograph I kept there, my grandmother at her kitchen table, the one person who had always told me plainly that I was worth more than I was being paid to believe, and walked out of a building where I had spent 7 years being invisible in plain sight. I had been planning this Monday for 6 months. Diane Pearce was not going to like how it started. To understand why I turned that phone face down and kept talking about centerpiece vendors, you have to understand what 7 years inside Pearce Events actually looked like from where I was standing, versus what it looked like from where Diane was standing, and why those two views had almost nothing in common. I met my husband James at 24 at a friend's dinner party, which is the kind of origin story that sounds invented but isn't. He was funny and warm and had the specific quality of a person who is genuinely interested in other people rather than performing interest, which I had learned by 24 to distinguish from the performance version because I had encountered enough of both to know the difference. We were married 2 years later, and I moved into the life that came with him, which included a close relationship with his mother Diane that I had every reason, in the early months, to believe was going to be one of the better things about the marriage. Diane Pearce was 61 when I met her, a woman who had built Pearce Events from a spare bedroom operation in the early 90s into a respected mid-sized event planning firm with an established client roster, a reputation for high-end corporate and social events, and the particular brand of confident, polished authority that comes from 3 decades of standing at the center of rooms that other people were paying significant money to have organized correctly. She was impressive. I want to say that clearly and without qualification because the story I am about to tell you is not the story of a mediocre woman who failed to credit the person doing her job for her. It is the story of a genuinely capable woman who had built something real and who had, somewhere along the way, developed the specific blindness of someone who has been the most impressive person in every room for so long that she had stopped being able to see the other people in the room clearly. She offered me a position at Pearce Events 4 months after James and I married. The offer was framed as an opportunity. She had been looking for someone with an organizational background. I had spent 3 years in project management at a corporate firm. The timing was convenient. What I understood only later was that the offer was also, in Diane's internal architecture of her world, a form of incorporation. By bringing me into the business, she was placing me in a context she controlled, giving me a role she defined, making me in the most practical sense hers to direct. I took the position because I was genuinely interested in the events industry and because the salary was fair and because I believed, at 26, that working closely with my mother-in-law was an opportunity to build something between us beyond the careful politeness of Sunday dinners. I was not wrong about the industry, I was significantly wrong about everything else. My official title at Pearce Events was Operations Coordinator, which is the kind of title that sounds specific and means almost nothing until you understand what operations actually involves in a business like this one, which is everything. Everything that is not standing in front of a client looking impressive and describing your vision for their event is operations. The vendor relationships, the contract negotiations, the logistics of 17 simultaneous moving parts on the day of an event, the management of a staff of 12 whose schedules, conflicts, and professional development I handled with the same quiet, unglamorous thoroughness I brought to everything in my life, the client follow-up after events, the systems I built from scratch in my first year because Pearce Events had been running on Diane's instincts and a filing cabinet for 30 years, and was quietly hemorrhaging efficiency in ways that nobody had named because nobody had been looking at the whole picture at once. I looked at the whole picture, it was what I was good at. And in my first year, I rebuilt the operational infrastructure of Pearce Events from the filing cabinet up, digital contract management, a vendor database with performance ratings and preferred pricing, a client communication protocol that reduced the average follow-up time from 11 days to 2, a staff scheduling system that eliminated the chronic double booking problem that had been causing quiet chaos for years before I arrived. I did all of this carefully and without announcement because I had learned early, both from my own family history and from watching how Diane operated, that announcing improvements before they were complete was a form of vulnerability I was not interested in. Diane noticed the improvements. She attributed them, in the particular way of a person who has been the author of everything in their world for a long time, to her own decision to bring me on board, which was not entirely wrong but was not quite right either. And the distinction between hiring someone capable and actually seeing what that person had done was one I watched her make consistently over the 7 years that followed. At industry events, she introduced me as her assistant, not her operations coordinator, not her operational director, which is what I effectively was by year 3. Her assistant. Said with the warmth of someone who meant it as a compliment, which made it simultaneously better and worse than if she had meant it as a diminishment, because genuine warmth is much harder to argue with than deliberate cruelty. I corrected her twice in the first year. Both times she nodded and said of course, and introduced me the same way at the next event, and by the second year I had stopped correcting her because I had understood that the correction was not landing as a correction, but as a social discomfort that reflected poorly on me rather than on her, and I did not have the energy to keep paying that cost. The clients knew who I was. That was the thing that sustained me through the years when the invisibility was at its heaviest. Angela, who would sit across from me 7 years later in my converted home office and tell me we were going to be a good fit, was not the first person to be referred to me specifically by name by a previous client who understood that the person who had made their event work was not the woman who stood at the front of the room describing her vision. The clients knew. Vendors knew, my staff of 12 knew with a certainty they never stated out loud because stating it would have made things difficult, and we were all, in our various ways, invested in not making things difficult. James knew, which is perhaps the most complicated part of the story and the part I have spent the most time sitting with since the Monday when the calls started coming in. He knew because he is not an unobservant man, and because he had been to enough events and enough industry dinners and enough quiet evenings where I came home with the operational weight of a company on my shoulders and none of the credit in my name to understand exactly what was happening. He knew, and he said on several occasions over 7 years, that he thought his mother should give me more recognition, that it wasn't right, that he was going to say something. He said it with genuine feeling. He did not say it to Diane. Or if he did, he said it in a way that produced no change, which in my experience is functionally identical to not saying it at all. I had learned by year 4 not to bring it home. Not because I had made peace with it, but because bringing it home produced a conversation that went nowhere and left me carrying both the original weight and the additional weight of James's guilt about not having fixed it, which was heavier than the original and less useful. I loved my husband. I also understood, clearly by year 5, that the particular dynamic between James and his mother was one he did not have the specific courage to disrupt, and that waiting for him to disrupt it was a form of waiting I could not afford. By year 6 I had built, quietly and in the hours outside of Pearce Events, a complete picture of what it would take to start a competing firm. Not a plan yet, a picture. The vendor relationships that were mine rather than Diane's. The ones where the vendor's primary contact was me, where my number was in their phone under my name rather than under Pearce Events. The clients whose renewal conversations I led. The systems I had built that existed in my documentation rather than in anyone else's institutional memory. The network I had accumulated over 6 years of being the person who showed up and did the actual work at every event, who remembered the venue coordinator's daughter's name and the preferred caterer's allergy protocols, and which florist needed payment 30 days in advance rather than the standard 60. I was not planning anything yet. I was simply paying attention. The way I had always paid attention, and what I was paying attention to was the shape of something I could build if the moment arrived that made building it necessary. The moment arrived in the form of Diane's daughter, Sophie. Sophie Pearce was 29, Diane's biological daughter from her first marriage, James's half-sister, a woman I had genuinely liked in the early years and maintained a careful, pleasant relationship with in the years when careful and pleasant was the best available option. Sophie had spent her 20s in a series of creative pursuits: photography, then interior design, then a travel blog that had a modest following and generated a modest income, and had joined Pearce Events 8 months before the Monday of the missed calls, in a role that Diane described as creative director and that the rest of us experienced as a person who attended client meetings and had opinions about color palettes. Sophie was not incompetent. She had genuine aesthetic instincts, and clients liked her energy. What she did not have, and what 8 months in a business is not sufficient time to develop, was any understanding of how the operational engine underneath the aesthetic surface actually worked. The vendors, the contracts, the logistics, the 12 staff members whose schedules I was still managing alongside everything else. Diane announced her retirement plan at a staff meeting on a Thursday morning in September. She was proud and emotional in equal measure, the way people are when they are handing something they built to the next generation, and she talked about legacy and continuity and the importance of keeping Pearce Events in family hands. She announced that Sophie would be taking over as CEO effective the first of the following year. She did not mention me during this announcement, not by name, not by role. She thanked the team for their dedication, and she looked, briefly, in my direction. And I held her look steadily and smiled the way I had been smiling for 7 years. Warm, professional, composed. And I did not say anything, because the decision had clearly already been made and the announcement was a delivery rather than a discussion. What Diane did not know, sitting at the head of that conference room on a Thursday morning in September, was that I had known this was coming for 4 months. I had known because Sophie had told me, in June, in the particular confiding way of someone who assumes the person they are confiding in has no power to do anything with the information. We had been at a vendor walkthrough together, and Sophie had mentioned casually that her mother was thinking about stepping back and that she had been having conversations with Sophie about the future of the business. She said it without apparent awareness of what it meant for me, which told me something important about how both she and her mother had categorized my role in the architecture of the company. I was the assistant. Assistants did not factor into succession planning. I had gone home that evening and opened the folder I had been building for 2 years, and I had started, for the first time, actually building the plan rather than just picturing it. 6 months. That was what I gave myself. 6 months to build Ashworth Events from a picture into a real company, quietly, without anyone at Pearce Events milling, because I understood that the moment anyone knew was the moment Diane would begin managing the situation in the way she managed all situations, from the front of the room, confidently, in ways that would make things harder for me. I incorporated Ashworth Events in July. I began carefully and without rushing, having conversations with vendors I had relationships with about my plans. Not poaching, not asking for commitments, simply letting people who trusted me know that I was building something and that I hoped, when the time came, they would consider working with me. The vendor community in the events industry is smaller than it looks from the outside, and 7 years of being the person who paid on time, communicated clearly, and solved problems without drama had built me a reputation that was entirely my own and entirely portable. I did not approach clients. That was a line I would not cross while I was still employed. But I did, in the months between July and September, make sure that every client interaction I had was the best it could possibly be. Every follow-up email faster. Every problem solved more smoothly. Every event executed with the specific attention that reminded people who had been working with Pearce Events for years why they kept renewing. not because I was building toward anything with them directly, because I wanted them to know exactly who had been taking care of them, so that when the time came, the name Ashworth Events would land on familiar ground. I resigned on a Friday afternoon in October, 2 weeks after Diane's announcement. I gave the standard 2 weeks notice, which I spent documenting every system and process I had built with the thoroughness of someone who understood that leaving things well is its own form of integrity regardless of how the other person has behaved. I trained Sophie personally on the vendor database I had built, the contract management system, the scheduling protocols. I was patient and professional and answered every question completely. Diane was gracious in the way she was gracious about everything, warm, slightly distracted, certain that things would be fine, because things in her world had always been fine. She thanked me for my years of service. She said I would be missed. She said it warmly and I believe she meant it, and I understood that it was possible to mean something warmly and still have spent 7 years not seeing it clearly. I cleaned out my desk on a Friday afternoon. I took my grandmother's photograph and a plant I had been growing from a cutting for 3 years and walked out of Pearce Events for the last time. On Saturday I rested. On Sunday I reviewed my client list, not Pearce Events' client list, my list. The names of people I had worked with directly, whose events I had managed personally, whose trust I had built over years, and I made sure Ashworth Events was ready for Monday. On Monday morning, Angela, the pediatric surgeon planning her daughter's June wedding, arrived at my home office at 9 o'clock for an appointment she had made through the Ashworth Events website that I had launched on Saturday morning. By 9:15 my phone was showing 17 missed calls from Diane Pearce. I turned it face down and talked about centerpiece vendors. I want to tell you what 7 years inside Pearce Events actually built, because I think it matters more than the Monday morning calls and the client transfers and the things that are easy to make dramatic, and because the building of it is the part that nobody saw and the part that I am most proud of, which is exactly why I need to tell it carefully before I tell you how it ended. When I arrived at Pearce Events in the spring of my 26th year, the business was running on 3 things that Diane had never quite named as the distinct and separate resources they actually were. The first was her reputation, which was real and earned, and the result of 3 decades of showing up and delivering, and which I want to be clear I never once tried to diminish or undermine, because it was genuinely hers and genuinely deserved. The second was her personality, the specific warm commanding presence that made clients feel simultaneously taken care of and slightly dazzled, which is the precise emotional combination that high-end event planning requires and which Diane had in abundance and which I did not have in the same way and knew it. And the third was the operational infrastructure of the business, which held the first 2 up the way a foundation holds a building, invisibly and completely, and which in the spring of my 26th year was held together by a combination of Diane's instincts, a part-time bookkeeper named Rhonda, who was competent but overwhelmed, and a filing system that occupied 3 full cabinets and had last been organized during the Obama administration. The filing system was where I started because it was the most honest picture of where the business actually was underneath the polished surface it showed to clients. I spent my first 3 weeks at Pearce Events doing nothing but reading contracts, vendor agreements, client correspondence, invoices, the paper trail of 30 years of a business that had grown faster than its administrative systems had kept up with. And by the end of those 3 weeks, I had a complete picture of the operational gap between what Pearce Events looked like from the outside and what it was running on inside. The gap was significant, not catastrophic. Diane's reputation and relationships had kept the business viable through inefficiencies that would have sunk a company without her specific combination of charm and industry credibility, but significant enough that I could see, with the particular clarity that comes from looking at a thing with fresh eyes and some analytical training, exactly where the energy was being lost and exactly what it would take to stop losing it. I did not present Diane with a report. That was my first and most important strategic decision at Pearce Events, and I made it instinctively rather than consciously, which is the kind of decision that tells you something about what you already understood even before you had the language for it. presenting Diane with a report about the operational gaps in her business would have required her to receive it as a critique of 30 years of her own management, which would have activated the specific defensiveness of a person who has been the most capable person in their world for a long time, and who therefore experiences unsolicited assessment as a form of challenge rather than assistance. Instead, I simply started fixing things quietly one at a time, in ways that produced visible improvements without requiring anyone to acknowledge that there had been a problem. The filing system became a digital contract management platform in the first month. I told Diane I had found a tool that would make renewal tracking easier, which was true, and set it up over a weekend without asking for approval or budget because the basic version was free and I paid for the upgrade myself because I was not going to wait for a budget approval conversation to fix something that was causing us to miss renewal windows. Rhonda, the bookkeeper, said it was the best thing that had happened to her in 3 years. Diane said it looked very organized and moved on to her next client call. The vendor database came next. This is the thing I want to spend some time on, because the vendor database was not just an organizational tool, it was the beginning of something I did not fully understand I was building until much later, which was a network of professional relationships that were mine in a way that the filing cabinet full of contracts had never been anyone's in particular. Event planning runs on vendors the way a city runs on infrastructure, invisibly, until something goes wrong, and then entirely. Caterers, florists, photographers, audiovisual companies, venue coordinators, lighting designers, rental companies, staffing agencies, transportation providers. Every event requires a specific combination of these, and the quality of the event depends not just on which vendors you choose, but on the quality of the relationship you have with them. Because vendors who trust you give you the preferential treatment that turns a good event into a great one, the extra hour of setup time, the upgraded linens when the originals don't arrive, the photographer who stays an extra 30 minutes because you've always paid on time and communicated clearly and treated them like a professional rather line item. I built the vendor database in my second month, and in building it, I did something that changed the nature of my role at Pearce Events in ways that took me years to fully understand. I called every vendor in Diane's Rolodex personally. Not to renegotiate anything, not to announce any changes, simply to introduce myself, to understand how they preferred to work, to ask what had gone well in their relationship with Pearce Events and what could be smoother. I took notes. I updated the database with preferences, payment terms, contact names, the name of the venue coordinator's daughter who had just started kindergarten, the preferred caterer's position on dietary accommodation requests, the florist's policy on substitutions when specific blooms weren't available. Those phone calls took 3 weeks of early mornings and lunch breaks. By the end of them, I knew every vendor Pearce Events worked with by first name. And more importantly, they knew me, not as Diane's assistant, as the person at Pearce Events who had called them, listened to them, taken notes, and followed up the following week with a small change to the standard contract language that addressed the payment timing issue. 3 of them had mentioned without being asked. That was the foundation. Everything else I built over the following 6 years was built on top of it. By year 2, I was managing all vendor relationships directly. Not because Diane had delegated this to me explicitly, she hadn't, not in so many words, but because I had made myself the obvious person to call when a vendor had a question, a problem, or a new capability they wanted to offer. And nature in professional relationships, as in everything else, tends to flow toward the path of least resistance. The vendors called me. I handled it. The events went smoothly. Diane stood at the front of the room looking impressive and describing her vision, and the machinery I had built hummed quietly underneath her, and nobody talked about the machinery. By year 3, I was running the staff of 12. Again, not because this had been formally assigned to me, my title remained Operations Coordinator, which I had stopped finding amusing and started finding instructive, in the way that a thing that should bother you but doesn't eventually tells you something about what you've decided to prioritize. I ran the staff because someone needed to run them, and I was the person in the building who understood what each of them was capable of and how to deploy those capabilities against the specific requirements of each event. I did the scheduling. I handled the conflicts, which in a team of 12 are frequent and occasionally spectacular. I managed the performance conversations that Diane found uncomfortable and therefore postponed indefinitely until I began handling them, at which point they became simply part of the operational rhythm of the business. The staff knew who was actually running things. People always know in a workplace who is actually running things, regardless of what the org chart says, because the org chart tells you who has the title and the day-to-day reality tells you who has the information and the judgment and the willingness to make the decisions that need making. My team came to me with their questions and their problems and their ideas, which I took seriously and acted on when they were good, which they frequently were, because 12 people who feel genuinely heard by the person managing them become 12 people who are invested in doing their jobs well, which is the operational definition of a functional team and which Pearce Events had not had, I came to understand, before I arrived. I want to tell you about Marcus Webb, because Marcus is the detail that explains the vendor relationships better than anything else I could tell you. Marcus Webb ran a catering company called Webb's Kitchen that had been a Pearce Events preferred vendor for 11 years before I arrived. He was a serious, precise man in his mid-50s who had built his catering business on the same principles I was building my operational systems on: attention to detail, consistent execution, the understanding that reputation in a service industry is built one event at a time and destroyed in the same increments. He and Diane had a cordial professional relationship built on mutual respect and the shared history of 11 years of events, and it was perfectly functional and entirely impersonal in the way of long professional relationships that have never been tested by anything genuinely difficult. In my third month at Pearce Events, we had a genuinely difficult situation. A corporate event for one of our anchor clients, a technology company that hosted a quarterly leadership dinner for 200 people, developed a catering crisis 48 hours before the event, when the venue's kitchen equipment failed a health inspection and the backup facility Marcus had planned to use was double-booked by a miscommunication I had not yet built systems to prevent. It was 2 days before the event, 200 people, a client who had been with Pearce Events for 6 years and no kitchen. I called Marcus at 7 in the evening. I explained the situation completely and without minimizing it, because I had already learned that the people you most need in a crisis respond better to honesty than to managed information. I told him I needed a solution by 9 the following morning and that I did not yet know what the solution was, but that I wanted him in the problem-solving conversation rather than simply waiting to be told what I had figured out. He was quiet for a moment and then he said he appreciated being called directly rather than finding out through a chain of intermediaries, which told me something about how vendor communications had been handled before I arrived. We talked for 40 minutes. By the end of the call, we had a workable solution involving a licensed commercial kitchen at a restaurant Marcus had a relationship with, whose Monday night closure gave us the access we needed. The event went smoothly. The client never knew. Marcus called me the following week, not to talk about anything specific, just to say that he had been in the catering business for 22 years, and that call had been one of the better professional conversations he had been part of in a difficult situation, and that he wanted me to know it. That call was the beginning of a professional relationship that went deeper than vendor and coordinator over the following 6 years, in the specific way that professional relationships go deep when two people share a commitment to doing things correctly and a willingness to be honest with each other when things are not going correctly. Marcus was one of the first vendors I called in July when I began building Ashworth Events, not to ask for a commitment but to tell him honestly what I was doing and why. And he listened to the whole thing and then said, in the precise, serious way he said everything, that he had been wondering when I was going to do this and that when I was ready to talk specifics he was ready to listen. He was not the only one who said something like that. Across the vendor conversations I had between July and September, I heard variations of the same sentiment from people who had been watching my situation at Pearce Events from the outside with a clarity that those of us inside it had not always had access to. They knew. The people who had been working alongside me for 6 years, who had been in the rooms where I solved the problems and managed the crises and built the systems, knew exactly what I was and what I was not being called, and they had opinions about it that they had never had occasion to share because I had never given them the opening. I gave them the opening in July, and what came back through it was something I had not fully expected, which was not just professional interest in working with Ashworth Events, but something warmer than that, a genuine investment in seeing what I was building succeed, the specific investment of people who have watched someone do good work in the dark for a long time and are relieved, finally, to be able to say so. By September, when Diane made her announcement at the staff meeting, Ashworth Events had vendor commitments from 9 of Pearce Events' 14 preferred vendors. not exclusive commitments. I had not asked for exclusivity and would not have, because that would have been a form of sabotage rather than competition, and I was building a business, not conducting a campaign. Simply commitments that if I called with a project, they would be available for it and would price it fairly and would bring to it the same professional attention they brought to everything else. 9 out of 14, built over 3 months of honest conversations with people who had been given a genuine choice and had made it based on 7 years of knowing exactly what working with me was like. I want to tell you what I did not do during those 6 months, because I think the things you choose not to do define you as much as the things you choose to do, and I made several deliberate choices about what lines I would not cross. I did not approach a single Pearce Events client before I resigned, not one. I did not hint, suggest, imply, or in any way communicate to any current client that I was building a competing firm or that they should consider moving their business. This was not purely strategic, it was also ethical, and I want to be clear about the distinction, because I think confusing strategic behavior with ethical behavior is one of the more common mistakes people make when they are telling stories about situations like this one. I did not approach clients before I resigned because I was still employed by Pearce Events, and using that employment to build my competitor's client base would have been a betrayal of a professional obligation regardless of how Diane had treated me. I had a standard of professional conduct that was mine, not contingent on how other people behaved, and I was not going to lower it because someone else had. What I did do was make sure that every interaction I had with every client in those final months was the best version of what I had always offered: responsive, precise, genuinely invested in the outcome of their event, so that the relationships were as strong as they could possibly be when the moment arrived that they were free to choose where to take their business. I also did not tell James. This was the decision that cost me the most, not strategically, but personally, and I want to spend a moment with it because I think it is the most honest part of the story, and the part that tells you the most about where our marriage actually was by the time I was building Ashworth Events in the evenings while my husband watched television in the next room. I did not tell James because I had tried, over 7 years, to tell him other things, smaller things, easier things, and what I had learned from those attempts was that James's loyalty to his mother operated at a depth that his genuine love for me had not yet reached. Not because he didn't love me. I believe he did and still does, and that belief is part of what makes the whole situation as complicated as it is. But when the loyalty to his mother and the loyalty to me came into conflict, which they did, regularly and consistently over 7 years, the resolution was always the same, and it always cost me rather than her. I had stopped making that cost visible because making it visible changed nothing and added to it. But I had not stopped feeling it, and somewhere near 5 I had made a decision, without articulating it to myself clearly, that I was going to build something that was not dependent on James's willingness to advocate for me, because his willingness had proven itself insufficient for the situation, and waiting for it to change was a form of waiting I could not keep affording. Building Ashworth Events in the evenings while James watched television in the next room was not an act of deception, it was an act of self-preservation, and I want to be honest that I understood the difference and chose it consciously. I was not hiding something from my husband out of manipulation or strategy. I was protecting something I was building from a dynamic I had 7 years of evidence was not safe for unfinished things. I told him on the Sunday before Monday. The evening before Angela's appointment, the evening before Diane's 17 calls, I sat down with James at the kitchen table and I told him everything. The incorporation in July, the vendor conversations, Ashworth Events, the resignation, what I had built and why, and what I expected Monday to look like. He was quiet for a long time. Not the dangerous kind of quiet, not the quiet of someone building toward an argument or processing toward anger, but the specific quiet of a person who is receiving information that is reshaping the picture they had of a situation they thought they understood. "You've been building this for 6 months," he said. "Yes," I said, while still at Mom's company. "Until 3 weeks ago, yes." He looked at the table. "Why didn't you tell me?" I told him the truth, the same truth I have told you, that I had learned over 7 years that unfinished things in the direction of his mother were not safe, and that I needed this to be finished before I shared it, because sharing it unfinished would have produced a conversation that risked the thing before it had the chance to become real. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "That's fair." And then, "I'm sorry it's fair." Those 4 words, "I'm sorry it's fair," were the most honest thing James had said to me about the situation with his mother in 7 years. And I held them carefully on my way to bed that night, the way you hold something that matters and that you are not yet sure what to do with. On Monday morning, Angela arrived at 9. My phone showed 17 missed calls by 9:15. I turned it face down and talked about centerpiece vendors, and James, in the kitchen of our house 30 feet away, heard the muffled professional warmth of his wife's first client meeting and did not interrupt it. He did not call his mother back either, not that morning. I found out later that he had sat at the kitchen table with his coffee for most of the time Angela and I were in the meeting, not doing anything in particular, just sitting with the specific knowledge of a man who has just understood, for the first time with complete clarity, exactly what has been happening in his house and his marriage and his mother's business for 7 years, and what his own silence has cost the person sitting in the next room talking about centerpiece vendors. That sitting, I think, was the beginning of something. I did not know it yet on Monday morning. I was in a client meeting, but it was the beginning, and beginnings matter even when you can't see them clearly from inside them. By the time Angela left at 10:15, my phone showed 22 missed calls from Diane. And somewhere across town, in the offices of Pearce Events, Sophie Pearce was arriving for her first full week as CEO of a company whose operational engine had walked out the door 3 weeks earlier and was beginning to understand in the specific and unforgiving way that operational reality tends to announce itself, exactly what that meant. Monday ended with 26 missed calls from Diane and 1 signed contract from Angela, who had texted me from her car to say she felt better about her daughter's wedding than she had since the whole planning process started. I printed the contract, added it to the Ashworth Events folder on my desk, and made a note to send Marcus Webb the preliminary catering brief by end of week. Then I went to the kitchen and made dinner, the same way I had made dinner every Monday for 7 years, because some things stay the same even when everything around them is changing. James was quiet through dinner. Not uncomfortably quiet, the specific quiet of a man who is thinking carefully about something rather than avoiding it. He asked about the meeting with Angela. I told him about it. He listened the way he had not listened to my work conversations in years, with the specific attention of someone who is trying to understand something they previously only half heard, and I noticed it without commenting on it because commenting on it felt like the wrong pressure to apply to something that was still finding its shape. After dinner he said, "Mom called me 14 times today." "I know," I said. "I didn't answer," he said. I looked at him across the table. He held the look steadily, which was its own kind of answer, and I understood that whatever James was working through in the quiet of that day at the kitchen table, he had arrived, at least for this evening, at a position. I did not ask him to define it more clearly than that, because I had learned over 7 years that pushing James toward a position before he had fully built it produced a version of the position that was less stable than the one he arrived at on his own, and I needed whatever he was building to be stable. "Okay," I said. And we talked about other things. Tuesday began with a phone call I had been expecting, but not quite in the form it arrived. At 8:47 in the morning, before my first scheduled call of the day, my phone rang with a number I recognized immediately. Robert Callahan, Managing Director of Callahan Technology, the company whose quarterly leadership dinner had been the crisis that first cemented my relationship with Marcus Webb 4 years earlier, and who had been a Pearce Events client for a decade. "Claire," he said without preamble, which was how Robert always communicated because Robert Callahan did not consider small talk a reasonable use of business hours. "I heard you left Pearce." 3 weeks ago, I said. "I've started my own firm." "Good," he said, with the specific brevity of a man confirming something he had already decided before he picked up the phone. "We have our Q1 dinner in February. I'd like to talk about moving it." I did not allow myself to react outwardly even though I was alone in my home office, because reacting outwardly to good news had always seemed to me like a form of spending energy better saved for doing the work that made the good news warranted. I told Robert I could meet Thursday. He said Thursday worked. We hung up and I sat for exactly 15 seconds feeling the specific satisfaction of a thing going the way the evidence suggested it would go, and then I opened my laptop and started the preliminary brief. Robert Callahan was not the only call on Tuesday. By end of day, I had heard from two more, the event coordinator for a regional law firm whose annual partner retreat I had managed for 3 consecutive years, and the founder of a women's leadership nonprofit whose annual gala represented the kind of event I found most genuinely satisfying to work on. Neither of them had been contacted by me. Both of them had heard through their own networks that I had left Pearce Events and had made the same calculation Robert Callahan had made, which was that the person who had actually been running their events had just become available as a standalone option and that this was a situation worth acting on quickly. By Tuesday evening, Ashworth Events had 4 active client conversations and 1 signed contract. I updated the folder. I called Marcus Webb and told him the catering brief timeline had accelerated. He said he had been expecting that. Diane called James 11 times on Tuesday. He answered on the 11th call. He told me about the conversation that evening, sitting at the same kitchen table with the same careful honesty he had been bringing to our evenings since Sunday. Diane had been, he said, distressed in a way he had not heard from her before, not the controlled, directed distress of a woman managing a difficult situation, but something more unmoored than that, the specific disorientation of a person whose understanding of their own world has turned out to be significantly less accurate than they believed. She had told James that clients were calling to ask questions that Sophie could not answer, that vendors were suddenly less responsive than they had been, that the operational systems she had always assumed were simply part of how Pearce Events ran had apparently required specific knowledge to operate that had walked out the door with me. She had used the word chaos, which James said was not a word his mother used lightly, and she had asked James to talk to me, to find out what it would take to bring me back, to act as the intermediary in a conversation she apparently did not yet feel ready to have directly. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her I didn't think that was a conversation I should be having on her behalf," James said. "I told her if she wanted to talk to you, she should call you directly." I held that for a moment. 7 years of watching James navigate the space between his mother and me, and this was the first time he had declined to occupy it. It was a small thing in the landscape of everything that had happened and everything that still needed to happen. But small things in a marriage are often the ones that matter most. "Thank you," I said. He nodded. He looked at the table. "I should have said that a long time ago," he said. I did not tell him it was okay because it wasn't, not fully, not yet. But I told him that it mattered that he said it now, which was true. Wednesday was the day that changed the shape of everything. I want to be precise about Wednesday because precision is how I understand things, and Wednesday deserves precision. At 9:14 in the morning, 11 minutes into my call with the law firm event coordinator, my phone lit up on the desk with a number I did not immediately recognize. I let it go to voicemail and finished the call. When I listened to the voicemail, it was from the personal assistant of a woman named Helena Marsh, no relation to any attorney, who is the founder of a luxury interior design firm and one of Pearce Events' most significant clients, a woman who hosted 4 major events per year with budgets that represented, conservatively, a fifth of Pearce Events' annual revenue. The message was brief. Helena Marsh would like to speak with Claire Ashworth at her earliest convenience regarding her upcoming spring portfolio showcase. I called back within 4 minutes. Helena Marsh answered her own phone, which told me something about how seriously she was taking the conversation. She was warm and direct in equal measure, which was how she operated in every context I had ever worked with her. And she asked me 3 questions. Was I genuinely independent? Did I have the vendor infrastructure to handle events of the scale she required? And was I available for a meeting this week? I answered yes to all 3. She said she had been thinking about this call since she heard I had left. She said, and I want to give you her exact words because they mattered to me more than most things said to me in those weeks, that she had been working with Pearce Events for 6 years, and that in those 6 years the quality of her events had tracked precisely and entirely with my personal involvement in them, and that she had understood this for at least 3 years and had simply never had the occasion to act on the understanding until now. I thanked her. I scheduled the meeting for Friday. After I hung up, I sat for a moment in my home office with the morning light coming through the garden window, and I thought about the 6 years of Helena Marsh's events, the spring portfolio showcases and the client appreciation dinners and the industry award ceremonies that I had managed from vendor brief to final walkthrough while Diane stood at the front of the room describing her vision, and I felt something I want to describe carefully because I think it is the most honest emotional note in this whole story. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that because triumph is the emotion people expect in a moment like this, and it was not what I felt. What I felt was something quieter and more complex, a specific, almost melancholy recognition that what was happening this week was simply the truth of 7 years becoming visible all at once, and that the truth had been true the entire time, and that the only thing that had changed was that now there was a structure for it to be seen in. The clients had always known, the vendors had always known, the staff had always known. The only people who had not known or who had known and chosen the more comfortable interpretation were Diane and Sophie and, in his own way, James. Now they were all in the process of finding out, and finding out, in my experience, is never quite as satisfying as the anticipation of it suggests, because it requires you to feel the full weight of how long the truth was invisible before it arrived. And that weight is heavier than triumph. I went back to work. By end of Wednesday, 11 of Pearce Events' 14 major clients had either signed with Ashworth Events or were in active conversation with me. I had not approached a single one of them. Every call had come from their side. I want to be precise about that because it matters, not just legally, which it does, but as an accurate description of what 7 years of invisible work actually produces when it is finally free to produce something. Diane arrived at my house at 4 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon, not a call this time. She rang the doorbell in the specific way of someone who has been calling for 3 days and has decided that the phone is an insufficient instrument for the conversation she needs to have. I opened the door. She was standing on my porch in a coat I recognized from industry events, her hair and posture as composed as they always were in professional contexts, and her face doing something I had never seen it do in 7 years. Which was showing without the usual warm, confident surface covering it, the full unmediated reality of what was underneath. She looked frightened, not angry. I had expected anger and had prepared myself for it. Frightened in the specific way of someone who has just understood that the thing they believed was solid was built on something they cannot now locate. "Can I come in?" she said. I stepped back and let her in. We sat at the kitchen table. The same table where James and I had been sitting every evening that week. The table that was becoming, that week, the place where the truth was being set down and examined from every angle. I made tea because making tea was what I did when difficult conversations needed to happen, and because the making of it gave both of us a few minutes to arrange ourselves before the conversation began. Diane wrapped her hands around the mug and looked at me with the directness she had always brought to business situations, and she said, "What would it take to bring you back?" I had known this question was coming. I had thought about how to answer it honestly since Sunday, because I did not want to give an answer in the heat of the moment that I had not thought through carefully, and because Diane deserved an honest answer rather than a reactive one regardless of what she had or had not given me over 7 years. "Nothing," I said. "I'm not coming back." She held my look. "Claire, I'm not saying that to punish you," I said. "I'm saying it because it's true. I've built something that is mine and I am not going to dismantle it. Not for any terms you could offer, because the terms were never the issue." She was quiet for a moment. "Then what was the issue?" And here is where I had to make a decision about how honest to be, because the honest answer was the full answer, and the full answer was going to cost something, and I had not decided in the days of preparation whether the full answer was what the moment called for, or whether a partial answer was sufficient. I looked at Diane across the kitchen table and I thought about the industry events, and the assistant introduction, and the 7 years of standing at the front of the room describing her vision while I made sure the vision had a room to stand in, and I decided that the full answer was the only one worth giving. "For 7 years," I said, "I ran your business, not assisted, not supported, ran. The vendors, the staff, the systems, the client relationships. I built most of what you have been standing on since 2018, and you introduced me as your assistant at every industry event we attended together." I paused. "I don't think you did it to be cruel. I think you genuinely didn't see it, which is its own kind of problem. But the result was the same. I spent 7 years being invisible in a business I was holding up, and I am not willing to do that anymore. So I built something where my name is on the door." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the garden window, the afternoon light was doing what it did in late October, the particular golden thinning of November approaching, and Diane sat with her hands around her mug and said nothing for long enough that I began to think she was not going to say anything at all. Then she said, "I know." 2 words. Not, "I'm sorry." Not you're wrong, not a defense or a redirection. Just, I know. I looked at her. She looked at the table. I've known for a while, she said. Longer than I've been comfortable with knowing it. It was easier, I think, to keep the picture I had of my business than to look at what the picture was actually made of. She stopped. That's not an excuse, I'm not offering it as one. I did not say anything. Some confessions need to be received without response. Sophie is in over her head, she said. I put her in an impossible position. I gave her a business without giving her the person who was actually running it, and I told myself that was succession planning when what it actually was. She stopped again. I don't know what it actually was. Something easier than looking at what I had done to you. She left an hour later, after a conversation that covered things I had not expected to cover that afternoon. The early years of Pearce Events. The pressures of building a business as a woman in an industry that had not always been welcoming. The specific fear of watching something you built become dependent on someone other than yourself. The complicated love a mother has for a daughter she wants to succeed at something, and the choices that love can make you blind to. I did not soften what I had said. I did not offer to come back or to consult or to make Diane's transition easier than it was going to be, because those offers would have been false and Diane had had enough of false things from the version of our relationship that had just ended. But I listened, the way I had always listened when listening was what the situation needed, and by the time she left the kitchen table there was something between us that had not been there when she rang the doorbell, which was not forgiveness exactly and not reconciliation, but something more durable than either, the specific relief of two people who have finally had the honest conversation instead of the comfortable one. At 6 o'clock that Wednesday evening, after Diane had left and I had sat alone at the kitchen table for 20 minutes processing the afternoon, James came home from work to find his wife and his mother had been sitting in his kitchen while he was at the office. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his coat still on and looked at me and asked how it had gone. I told him, all of it. The conversation took 40 minutes and James sat across from me without interrupting, which was the right thing to do and which he knew it was the right thing to do, and when I finished he sat quietly for a moment, and then he said the thing that I think finally broke open the version of our marriage that had been slowly calcifying for 7 years. He said, I owe you an apology that's going to take longer than tonight to give properly. But I want to start giving it tonight if you'll let me. I looked at my husband across the kitchen table and I thought about 7 years of Sunday dinners and industry events and evenings where I came home carrying a weight I had stopped describing, and I thought about Marcus Webb saying he had been wondering when I was going to do this, and Helena Marsh saying the quality of her events had tracked precisely and entirely with my personal involvement, and Angela the pediatric surgeon saying we were going to be a good fit. Yes, I said, start tonight. James's apology did not arrive in a single conversation. It arrived the way real apologies arrive between people who have been married long enough to know that words without corresponding action are just another version of the comfortable story, incrementally, in the specific daily choices of a man who had finally understood what his silence had cost and was, for the first time, actively choosing differently. The first choice came Thursday morning when Diane called again and James answered and told her, clearly and without the careful hedging he had always used when navigating between us, that he supported what I was building, that he was not going to ask me to reconsider, and that if she wanted a relationship with her daughter-in-law going forward it was going to need to look different from the one they'd had for the past 7 years. He told me about the call that evening. He did not present it as a heroic act because he understood it wasn't one, it was the minimum of what the situation required and he was 7 years late to it. But it was real, and real things, even late ones, have weight. The second choice was quieter. He started asking about Ashworth Events the way he had never asked about my work at Pearce Events, not the polite surface questions of a husband performing interest, but the real questions, the follow-up ones, the ones that require you to have listened carefully to the previous answer before you can ask them. What was the meeting with Helena Marsh like? How was Marcus handling the increase in volume? What did I need from him practically as the business grew? He asked these questions at dinner, over coffee on weekends, during the drive to his parents' house for Thanksgiving, which was its own particular test of how the new version of things was going to hold up in the presence of the old version. Thanksgiving was complicated, which I will not pretend otherwise. Diane was composed and gracious in the way she was always composed and gracious in social situations, and Sophie was quieter than usual in the way of someone who has spent 6 weeks learning the distance between a title and a capability. James sat beside me at the table, and when his mother made a comment about events industry contacts that could help a new firm get established, the kind of comment that in previous years would have landed as a subtle reminder of her authority in my world, James said mildly that Claire's client list was growing faster than either of them had expected and changed the subject, and the comment did not land where it was aimed. Small things. But I had spent 7 years watching small things accumulate into the architecture of a dynamic that had cost me significantly, and I understood better than most that small things in the other direction accumulate too. Sophie called me in November, not to ask me to return. She had, I think, understood from the week of Wednesday's calls that returning was not a conversation I was going to have. She called to ask if I would be willing to meet for coffee, just the two of us, without Diane or James or the professional history as the explicit subject. I agreed because I was genuinely curious about what she wanted to say, and because I had never had a quarrel with Sophie that was about Sophie specifically rather than about the situation she had been placed in by her mother, without fully understanding what she was stepping into. We met at a coffee shop on a Thursday morning, and Sophie did something I had not expected, which was to begin the conversation by saying that she owed me an acknowledgement. Not an apology exactly. She was precise about the distinction, in a way that told me she had thought about it carefully before she arrived. She said she had not understood, when she joined Pearce Events, what the operational reality of the business actually was, or what my role in it had been, and that the 8 weeks since I left had provided the most thorough education she had ever received on that subject. She said she was not going to pretend she could rebuild what I had built in the time I had built it, but that she was committed to learning what she hadn't known and to running Pearce Events honestly rather than on the borrowed credibility of systems she didn't understand. She asked if I would be willing over time and on my terms to be a resource she could call occasionally when she encountered something she genuinely didn't know how to handle. Not a consulting arrangement, not a formal relationship, just the possibility of a conversation when the situation required it. I thought about it honestly, which took longer than the coffee shop pause probably suggested to Sophie, because it was a question that had layers. The answer I arrived at was yes, with one condition, which was that any such conversation would be between us directly and would not be routed through Diane or James or anyone else, because I had spent 7 years being someone else's resource through channels I didn't control, and I was not going to do that again in any form. Sophie said that was completely fair. We finished our coffee and talked about other things, and when we left she said she hoped things were good, and I told her they were, and I meant it. Pearce Events survived. I want to tell you that plainly because I think the honest version of this story is more interesting than the version where everything I built came at the complete expense of everything Diane built, and the honest version is that Pearce Events contracted significantly. They lost 9 of 14 major clients in the first quarter after my departure, which was a serious blow to the revenue base and required real restructuring, but it did not collapse. Diane came out of retirement in January, not as CEO but in a business development role that played to what she had always been genuinely excellent at, which was walking into rooms and making people feel taken care of. Sophie ran operations, learning as she went with the specific urgency of someone who no longer has anyone else to rely on for the learning. They hired 2 new coordinators by spring. They were not the business they had been. But they were a business, and I had not set out to destroy a business. I had set out to build one, and there is a difference that matters to me. Ashworth Events ended its first year with 14 clients, 8 of whom had come from Pearce Events and 6 of whom were entirely new relationships built on referrals from those first 8. Marcus Webb catered 11 of our events in that first year and told me at the end of December with his characteristic precision that it had been the best professional year he had experienced in a long time. Helena Marsh's Spring Portfolio Showcase was the event I was most proud of, not because it was the largest, though it was, but because Helena pulled me aside at the end of the evening and said that it was the first event she had hosted in 6 years where she had felt completely confident from the planning stage through the final hour, and that the difference was knowing exactly who was responsible for every moving part and being able to talk to that person directly. Her name was on the contract, my name was on the contract, nobody in the room was anyone's assistant. I hired my first employee in March. A young coordinator named Priya, who had been on my Pearce Events staff and who had called me in January to ask, with the directness I had always appreciated in her, whether there was a position at Ashworth Events and whether I would consider her for it. I had been considering her since July. I told her that. She started the following week and has been the best operational decision I have made since incorporating, which is saying something because most of the decisions I have made since incorporating have been good ones. By the end of the first year, I had moved Ashworth Events out of my converted home office and into a proper suite, small, well-lit, with a conference table that was not second-hand and a window that looked at a street rather than a garden I had been neglecting. I stood in the empty space the day we signed the lease, and I thought about the first day I had walked into Pearce Events 14 years younger, and about the filing cabinets, and about the vendor calls that had taken 3 weeks of early mornings and lunch breaks, and about Marcus Webb saying he had been wondering when I was going to do this. I had been wondering too for longer than I had admitted to myself. The answer, it turned out, was when the moment made it necessary. And the moment had made it necessary on a Thursday morning in September when a woman I had worked for had stood at the head of a conference room and handed the thing I had built to someone else without once saying my name. I do not regret that Thursday. I would not change it. It gave me the precise and necessary push that 7 years of wondering had not quite provided, and for that, for the specific gift of the moment that finally made the decision unmistakable, I am, in the complicated, honest way of someone who has processed a thing thoroughly enough to find what is true in it, almost grateful. Almost. Diane and I have arrived at something over the course of the year that I did not design and did not predict, but that I think is the most honest thing available to two people in our situation, which is a cautious and genuine mutual respect. She came to the Ashworth Events' first anniversary gathering in October. A small thing, a drinks evening for clients and vendors, nothing elaborate, and she stood in the suite I had leased and looked around at the people in the room, the Marcus Webbs and the Helena Marshes and the Priya, who was managing the evening with the specific calm competence of someone who had been trained in an environment that valued it, and she said to me, quietly, beside the window, "You built something real." I told her I had been building it for 7 years. She understood what I meant. She nodded, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough. James and I are still married. I want to be clear about that because I think the story might suggest otherwise, and the truth is more complicated and more hopeful than a clean ending in either direction. We are still married, and the marriage is different from the marriage that existed before the Monday of the missed calls, which is to say, it is more honest, more equal, more genuinely reciprocal than it was, and also still in the process of becoming what I think it has the capacity to be, which requires time and the specific patience of two people who have decided that what they have is worth the work of making it better. He came to the anniversary gathering too. He stood beside me at the window when Diane said you built something real, and he put his hand briefly on my back, the specific touch of a man who is trying to say something that he has not yet found the full words for, and I leaned into it slightly, which was my way of telling him the words were not required tonight. If you have ever spent years doing the work that held something up, while someone else stood at the front of the room taking the credit, if you have ever been introduced as the assistant when you were the architect, tell me about it in the comments, because I read everyone and I want you to know something that took me 7 years and 1 Monday morning to understand fully. The clients always knew, the vendors always knew, the people who worked alongside you always knew. The truth of what you were doing was never invisible to the people it actually served. It was only invisible to the person who needed the most comfortable version of the story to stay comfortable. And the moment you stop providing that comfort, the moment you simply pick up your grandmother's photograph and walk out of the building for the last time, the truth has nowhere left to hide. Subscribe to Family Revenge Co., where the quiet ones always get the last word. I'll see you at the next table.